It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Arthur Beaumont III laughed as he poured the vintage red wine over Sloane Sterling's dress in front of the entire charity committee. The deep crimson liquid bloomed across her beige linen bodice like a fresh wound, the scent of fermented grapes and oak filling the air between them. Around the mahogany table, the city's elite went silent, their breath catching in a collective gasp that quickly dissolved into stifled, cruel snickers. "Oh, terribly sorry," Arthur said, though his eyes danced with malicious delight. He didn't pull back the decanter until the last drop had stained her collar. He set the crystal vessel down with a deliberate clink of his heavy gold signet ring against the glass. "I suppose I thought you were the help, standing there in that, what is that material? Burlap. You really should have checked the dress code before coming to the Beaumont estate, Sloane." Sloane Sterling didn't flinch. She felt the cold, sticky moisture seeping through her chemise, clinging to her skin, but her hands remained steady at her sides. She looked at the man standing over her, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke silk blazer that cost more than most people earned in a quarter. He was the president of the Heritage Committee, a man who viewed the world as a collection of assets to be bullied or bought. Beside him, Lydia Vance tittered, her manicured hand fluttering to her throat. "Arthur, really? You've ruined her little outfit," though, to be fair, she was practically invisible until the wine hit her. Modesty is a virtue, I suppose, but poverty is just a lack of imagination. Lydia's laugh was like shattering glass, sharp and artificial. The other committee members began to murmur, their eyes raking over Sloane with a mixture of pity and disdain. To them, she was a clerical error, a low-level representative from a firm they had never heard of, invited only by a technicality in the bylaws. "I'll survive the stain, Arthur," Sloane said, her voice calm and level. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of the long game. The wine, however, was a 1982 Petrus. It's a shame to see such potential wasted on the floor. Arthur's face flushed a mottled purple. He hated when she spoke like that, with a refined cadence that suggested she knew exactly what he was throwing away. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive cigars and unearned confidence radiating from him. "Don't lecture me on potential," he hissed, leaning down so only she could hear the jagged edge of his voice. "You're a mouse in a room full of lions. You don't belong at this table, you don't belong in this house, and by the time the governor arrives this evening, you won't even belong in this zip code. I've already moved to have your firm's credentials revoked." He turned away from her, dismissing her existence with a flick of his wrist. "Marcus," he barked. Marcus Thorne, the head waiter, appeared from the shadows of the dining hall. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but Sloane caught the briefest flicker of sympathy in his eyes as he looked at her ruined dress. He had seen Arthur's tantrums before, but this was a new level of public cruelty. "Clean this up," Arthur commanded, gesturing vaguely at the floor and Sloane. "And see to it that Ms. Sterling finds the service exit. She's making the room smell like a cellar." Marcus stepped forward, his movements stiff. "Sir, perhaps the lady would like to—" "The service exit, Marcus," Arthur snapped, his voice booming through the hall. "I won't have the governor walking in to find a wine-soaked charity case lurking in the foyer. She's finished here." Sloane felt the weight of the Aegis Capital signet ring hidden in the velvet lining of her clutch. It was a simple piece of jewelry, but it carried the weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire that Arthur Beaumont III couldn't even fathom. She could have ended it then. She could have reached into her bag, pulled out the acquisition documents Julian Vane had prepared, and watched Arthur's world collapse before the first course was served. But a lion doesn't roar at a flea. Not yet. She watched as Lydia Vance leaned in to whisper something in Arthur's ear, causing him to erupt in another bout of boisterous, condescending laughter. They were so sure of their safety, so insulated by the Beaumont name and the marble walls of the estate. They didn't notice the way Sloane's eyes remained cold, tracking every movement, recording every insult. "There's no need for an escort, Marcus," Sloane said, her voice carrying just enough to cut through Arthur's laughter. She stood tall, the wine stain a badge of office she wore with more dignity than Arthur wore his family crest. "I know exactly where I stand." She turned and walked toward the grand oak doors, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the polished stone. Behind her, she heard Arthur call out one last time. "And don't bother coming back for the gala, Sloane. We're serving vintage tonight and you've clearly got a taste for vinegar." The room erupted in a final wave of laughter. Sloane didn't look back. She stepped out into the cool evening air of the terrace, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long, jagged shadows across the manicured lawn. She pulled her phone from her clutch and tapped a single name. Julian Vane answered on the first ring. "Is it done?" Julian asked, his voice like dry parchment. Sloane looked back at the glowing windows of the Beaumont estate, where the silhouettes of the elite toasted to their own brilliance. She could see Arthur at the center of it all, preening for his audience. "He just poured the wine, Julian," Sloane said, her voice dropping to a whisper that promised a storm. "Start the clock. I want everything they own under the Aegis umbrella by Monday morning. And Julian?" "Yes, Sloane. Make sure we keep the wine cellar. I have a feeling Arthur is going to be very thirsty where he's going." She ended the call and walked toward her modest sedan parked at the edge of the drive. The countdown had begun, and Arthur Beaumont III was still laughing, blissfully unaware that he had just handed the keys to his kingdom to the woman he had tried to drown in a glass of red wine. The following afternoon, the sun hit the bronze plaque of the Beaumont committee room with a blinding, undeserved brilliance. Sloane Sterling walked down the limestone hallway, her heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic finality. She felt the weight of the leather portfolio in her hand, a silent, paper-thin guillotine. Inside the mahogany-paneled room, the air smelled of expensive cigars and old, inherited secrets. Arthur Beaumont III sat at the head of the long table, leaning back with a glass of scotch despite the early hour. Lydia Vance sat to his right, her sharp features twisted into a smirk as she whispered something in his ear. Two other committee members chuckled, their eyes darting to Sloane as she entered. "Ah, the charity case returns," Arthur said, his voice booming with a jovial cruelty that made the other members grin. He didn't stand. He didn't even set down his glass. "I assume you're here to apologize for your performance at the estate last night. The wine stain on the rug was almost as unsightly as that dress." Lydia let out a tittering laugh, adjusting her silk scarf. "Now, Arthur, be kind. I'm sure Sloane did her best with what little she has. It's not everyone who can afford a tailor, Anna." "What is it you do again, dear? Data entry?" Sloane didn't sit. She stood at the foot of the table, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. "I'm here for the committee briefing, Arthur." "About that." Arthur set his glass down with a heavy thud, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. "The committee has held a private vote. Given your lack of social standing and the recent unpleasantness, we've decided to revoke your membership, effective immediately." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a predator's strike. Sloane looked down at the paper. It was a formal dismissal, signed in Arthur's arrogant, loopy script. "You're kicking me off the board?" she asked softly. "We're pruning the garden, Sloane," Arthur sneered, leaning forward. His cologne, a cloying mix of vetiver and entitlement, drifted toward her. "The governor's gala is in 3 days. We can't have the help sitting at the head table. It sends the wrong message to our investors. People like you are meant to serve the wine, not drink it." Sloane felt the familiar spark of cold rage, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. Instead, she reached into her portfolio and pulled out a blue-bound folder. She didn't hand it to him. She dropped it on the table with a crisp, authoritative snap. "Funny you should mention investors," Sloane said. Her voice was low, carrying a sudden, predatory weight that made Lydia's smile falter. "Because while you were voting to prune your garden, Aegis Capital was busy buying the soil." Arthur's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "That folder contains a revocation notice of its own," she continued, her gaze locking onto his. "Aegis has just acquired the primary debt of Beaumont Holdings. Your line of credit has been frozen. Your personal assets, including the estate you were so proud of last night, are now under secondary review for collateral inconsistency. The color drained from Arthur's face, leaving it a mottled, sickly gray. That's impossible. Aegis is a global firm. They wouldn't bother with. They would if their CEO told them to, Sloane interrupted. She leaned down, her hands flat on the table, invading his space. Marcus Thorne, the head waiter from last night, he's been keeping very detailed logs of the discretionary spending you've been funneling through the committee's accounts. Embezzlement is such an ugly word, isn't it? Arthur tried to speak, but his throat seemed to have seized. Lydia Vance pulled her chair back, her eyes wide as she looked from Arthur to the blue folder, already calculating how to distance herself from the sinking ship. Sloane straightened her blazer, her fingers brushing the hidden Aegis signet ring in her pocket. The secret power she had spent years building was finally beginning to manifest, and the look of sheer, unadulterated terror on Arthur's face was better than any vintage wine. 3 days, Arthur, Sloane said, her voice like a closing door. The governor's gala is in 3 days. I'd suggest you start looking for a suit you can afford to lose, because by the time the first toast is poured, you won't even own the chair you're sitting in. She turned and walked out, leaving the dismissal notice sitting untouched on the table. Behind her, she heard the sound of Arthur's glass shattering against the floor, but she didn't look back. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and the sleeping lion was no longer interested in silence. 2 days later, the morning sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sloane's private office, casting long, predatory shadows across the mahogany desk. The air here was different from the committee rooms. It lacked the stagnant scent of old money and unearned privilege. Instead, it smelled of fresh bond paper, expensive toner, and the bitter, dark espresso sitting in a delicate porcelain cup by her elbow. Sloane Sterling sat in the center of her empire, her fingers tracing the raised Aegis lion on her signet ring. The metal was cold, a stark contrast to the simmering heat of anticipation building in her chest. Julian Vane stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the glass. He was a man who moved with the quiet lethality of a scalpel, and as he turned, he held a thick cream-colored dossier. He didn't need to speak for Sloane to know the news was good. In the world of high-stakes acquisitions, Julian was the herald of the end. The final pieces have snapped into place, Julian said, his voice a low, cultured rasp. He placed the dossier on the desk, the heavy thud of paper sounding like a gavel. Arthur Beaumont III has been busy. He spent the last 48 hours trying to leverage the committee's remaining assets to cover his personal margins. He thinks he's shoring up his defenses. In reality, he's just handing us the keys to his front door. Sloane flipped open the folder. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the digital trail of a man who believed he was too big to fall. He's desperate, she murmured, a thin smile touching her lips. Desperate men make for excellent theater. He's more than desperate, Julian replied, leaning over the desk. He's arrogant. He used the governor's name on 3 separate offshore wire transfers this morning. He's not just embezzling anymore, he's committing political suicide. He's banking everything on the success of the gala. He thinks the governor's presence will validate his position and silence the board. The sharp chime of Sloane's personal cell phone cut through the room. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID was a name she had intentionally left unblocked, waiting for this exact moment of peak hubris. She signaled for Julian to remain silent before answering. I hope you've started looking for a new career, Sloane. Arthur's voice boomed through the line, thick with the wet, heavy sound of a man who had already started on his midday scotch. I just had a very productive lunch with the board. We've decided that your little blue folder from the other day was nothing more than a desperate fabrication, a pathetic attempt by a commoner to rattle a king. Sloane leaned back, her gaze fixed on the hawk circling the skyscrapers outside. A king, Arthur. Is that what you're calling yourself these days? I didn't realize kings had to raid their own charity funds to pay for their mistress's jewelry. There was a jagged silence on the other end, followed by a sharp, barking laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're out of your depth. My family built the foundation of this city while yours was likely sweeping the streets. You can wear the suits and sit in the offices, but you don't have the blood. You're a clerical error, and by Friday night, I'll have you erased. Don't even think about showing up to the gala. I've personally instructed security to have you removed the moment you step onto the property. It's a night for the elite, not for the help. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Sloane said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. In fact, I'm looking forward to your toast. It's going to be unforgettable. She ended the call before he could respond, the silence that followed feeling heavy and charged. The rage spike she'd felt at his words didn't make her hands shake. It only sharpened her focus. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he couldn't see the cliff he was walking toward. An hour later, Sloane moved to a much humbler setting, a dimly lit bistro on the edge of the financial district where the air smelled of roasted garlic and old secrets. Marcus Thorne was already there, tucked into a corner booth. The head waiter looked smaller than he did in his formal tuxedo, his shoulders hunched as he nursed a glass of water. He's been using the service entrance to move the physical ledgers, Marcus whispered as Sloane slid into the booth. He pushed a small, encrypted USB drive across the table, his hand trembling slightly. I saw him, Sloane. He was screaming at Lydia Vance in the coach room, telling her that if the governor asks about the missing endowment, she's to blame the accounting firm. He's setting everyone up to take the fall. Sloane covered the drive with her hand, her touch steady and reassuring. You've done the right thing, Marcus. Arrogance like his requires a witness. You won't have to worry about your position once this is over. Aegis looks after its own. I don't care about the job, Marcus said, his voice gaining a sudden, hard edge. I just want to see him lose. I want to see him realize that the people he treats like furniture are the ones who took away his floor. Sloane nodded, the weight of the drive in her pocket feeling like a loaded weapon. She left the bistro and stepped back out into the bright city light. Everything was ready. The evidence was secured, the ally was poised, and the antagonist had reached the peak of his entitlement. Back at her desk, she looked at the gold-embossed invitation to the governor's gala. She picked up a fountain pen, the nib scratching satisfyingly against a final legal document, the formal acquisition of the committee's primary debt holders. 48 hours. Arthur Beaumont III thought he was hosting the social event of the decade. He didn't realize he was merely the guest of honor at his own professional execution. Sloane stood, her eyes reflecting the cold, gray steel of the skyline. The sleeping lion had finished its preparations. Now, it was just a matter of time. 24 hours remained. The grand atrium was a hive of frantic activity, the air thick with the cloying scent of fresh-cut calla lilies and the sharp, chemical tang of industrial floor polish. Sloane Sterling stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold brass railing as she watched the chaos below. From this height, the people scurrying across the marble floor looked like ants, unaware of the foot about to descend. Arthur Beaumont III was at the center of the storm, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings like a whip crack. He was currently berating Marcus Thorne, who stood perfectly still, while Arthur jabbed a finger toward a stack of vintage crates. I told you these were to be chilled to exactly 44 degrees, you idiot, Arthur hissed. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson that clashed with his silk tie. If the governor tastes a lukewarm drop of champagne because of your incompetence, I'll ensure you're blacklisted from every high-end venue in the tri-state area. Do you understand me? Marcus didn't blink, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. Of course, Mr. Beaumont. I'll see to it immediately. Sloane descended the grand staircase, her heels making a steady, rhythmic click on the stone, a sound of deliberate, calm purpose. Arthur turned at the sound, his eyes raking over her simple navy dress with visible disdain. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light with a predatory glint. Sloane, I thought I made it clear that committee staff wasn't required for the final walkthrough, he said, his voice dripping with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world was his personal footstool. This is for the principals, people who actually matter to the evening's success. I'm not here as staff, Arthur, she replied, her voice level and chillingly quiet. She stopped 3 feet from him, occupying his space without hesitation. I'm here to offer a final courtesy. You've spent a lot of time building this image, but you've forgotten to check the foundations. It would be a shame if a sudden breeze caught your house of cards. Arthur let out a sharp, barking laugh that drew the attention of the nearby decorators. Lydia Vance hovered at his elbow, her eyes darting between them. Lydia's hand tightened on her designer clutch, the leather creaking in the sudden silence. She seemed to notice something in Sloane's gaze, a terrifying lack of fear that didn't align with their previous encounters. A breeze. My position is granite, Sterling, Arthur sneered, stepping closer until the heavy, suffocating scent of his sandalwood cologne overshadowed the lilies. You're a footnote in this committee's history, a temporary clerical necessity. After tomorrow night's success, I'm recommending the board terminate your contract immediately. You simply don't have the pedigree for the direction I'm taking this organization. Sloane felt the steady vibration of her phone in her pocket. It was the prearranged signal from Julian Vane. The final wire transfers were complete. The debt acquisition was legally binding. She didn't flinch at Arthur's proximity. Instead, she leaned in slightly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. Pedigree is just a word people use when they're afraid of the future, Arthur, she whispered. Enjoy the gala, truly. It's going to be the most memorable night of your life. Just remember, when the floor disappears, it's a long way down. Arthur scoffed, turning back to Lydia. See, the pressure has finally snapped her. She's speaking in riddles now. He dismissed Sloane with a wave of his hand, as if brushing away a persistent fly. Go find a seating chart to fret over, Sloane. Try to stay out of the way of the important people. Sloane turned and walked away without another word. She didn't look back as she exited the atrium and stepped into the cool evening air. An hour later, she sat in Julian's darkened office. The only light came from the glow of 3 computer monitors, reflecting off the crystal decanter on the desk. Julian handed her a single sheet of paper, the formal notice of default for the Beaumont family's primary holding company. He has no idea, Julian said, his voice laced with a grim sort of satisfaction. He spent the afternoon approving the menu while we were filing the liens. Sloane looked out at the city skyline, the lights of the governor's mansion visible in the distance. She touched the paper, feeling the crisp, sharp edge of the document. He thinks he's the host, she said softly. He doesn't realize he's the main course. She stood up, smoothing her dress. The preparation was over. The warnings had been ignored. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion would finally wake up. And Arthur Beaumont III would find out exactly what happens when you treat the person holding the keys like they don't belong in the room. The evening of the Beaumont Gala arrived with a suffocating sense of opulence. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the air thick with the cloying, sweet scent of 1,000 white lilies. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured, amber light over the elite of the city, their laughter tinkling like the expensive glassware they held. Sloane Sterling stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers lightly brushing the cold marble railing. She wore a floor-length dress of midnight black silk, simple, unadorned, and utterly invisible against the backdrop of the peacocking socialites below. To anyone watching, she looked like a guest who had wandered into the wrong party, a quiet shadow in a room built for light. But beneath the silk, tucked into a hidden pocket, the weight of the default notice Julian had given her felt like a live wire against her skin. At the center of the room, Arthur Beaumont III was holding court. He looked every bit the master of the universe, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke velvet dinner jacket. Beside him, Lydia Vance draped herself over his arm like a decorative scarf, her laughter echoing a second too late after every one of his jokes. "It's about legacy," Arthur's voice boomed, carrying easily over the soft strains of the string quartet. He gestured broadly with a crystal flute of vintage champagne. "Some people are born to build empires, and others are born to polish the brass. The trick is knowing which one you are before you try to walk through the front door." Lydia giggled, tapping his chest. "Oh, Arthur, you're so cruel, but you're right. There's nothing worse than someone who doesn't know their place." Sloane watched as Marcus Thorne approached their circle, carrying a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres. Marcus moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent 20 years in service, but as he offered the tray, his hand brushed against the sleeve of Arthur's jacket. It was a microscopic error, a ghost of a touch. Arthur's smile didn't just fade, it curdled. He looked down at his sleeve as if a cockroach had crawled across it. "Watch it, Thorne," Arthur snapped, the volume of his voice dropping into a low, dangerous hiss that nevertheless caught the ears of the nearby guests. "This jacket costs more than your house. If you can't handle a tray without pawing at the guests, I'll have you back in the scullery by midnight. Do you understand?" Marcus bowed his head, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, though Sloane saw his jaw tighten. "My apologies, Mr. Beaumont. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't," Arthur muttered, turning back to his admirers as if Marcus had ceased to exist. "It's the help these days, no discipline." Sloane felt a slow, cold heat rising in her chest. She began to descend the stairs, her movements deliberate. As she reached the ballroom floor, she caught the eye of Julian Vane, who was standing near the bar. He offered a nearly imperceptible nod. The legal teams were in place. The filings were live. The trap was set, and Arthur was currently dancing in the middle of it. "Ah, look what the cat dragged in," Arthur said, his eyes finding Sloane as she approached. He didn't lower his voice. If anything, he projected it further, drawing the attention of a group of board members and their wives. "Sloane, I'm surprised you found the courage to show up. I assumed you'd be halfway to the airport by now, looking for a city with a lower cost of living." Lydia smirked, her eyes scanning Sloane's black dress with visible disdain. "Is that the same dress from the committee meeting, dear? It's very functional." "It serves its purpose," Sloane said quietly. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the performative volume of Arthur's arrogance. "I suppose it does," Arthur said, stepping closer until he was looming over her. The smell of expensive scotch and tobacco rolled off him. "But let's be clear. You're only here because I haven't had security escort you out yet. I thought it might be educational for you to see how a real event is run before you scurry back to whatever hole you crawled out of." He turned to the group, his grin widening. She actually thought she could challenge the committee's direction. Can you imagine? A little girl with a big title and a very small bank account trying to tell the Beaumonts how to spend their money. A few of the board members chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between Arthur's red-faced glee and Sloane's icy silence. "I'm not here to tell you how to spend your money, Arthur," Sloane said. She reached out and took a glass of water from a passing tray, her fingers steady against the cold glass. "I'm just here to see how you spend everyone else's." Arthur's eyes narrowed, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. "Careful, Sloane. You're one word away from being banned from every club in this city. You don't belong here. You never did." Before he could continue, a hush rippled through the room. The grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, and the chatter died down to a frantic whisper. Governor Harrison stepped into the room, flanked by 2 aides. He scanned the crowd, his gaze landing on the central group. Arthur's posture changed instantly. The bully vanished, replaced by a sycophant so desperate to please it was almost physical. He practically shoved Lydia aside to straighten his tie. "Governor," Arthur called out, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "You're just in time. We were just about to begin the toast to the new development project." The governor walked toward them, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at Arthur. His eyes were fixed on Sloane. "Arthur," the governor said, his voice clipped, "I received your message about the gala, and I received a very different message from the Sterling group an hour ago." Arthur froze, his hand halfway to the governor's shoulder. "The Sterling group? I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Sloane here was just leaving, actually." Sloane didn't move. She took a slow sip of her water, watching Arthur over the rim of the glass. The silence in the room was absolute now, the kind of silence that precedes a crash. "I'm not leaving, Arthur," Sloane said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "In fact, I think it's time you took the stage. You've worked so hard for this moment." Julian Vane appeared at her side, his briefcase clicked shut with a sound like a gavel. He looked at Arthur with the clinical detachment of an executioner. "The governor is right, Mr. Beaumont," Julian said. "There is no misunderstanding, only a deadline that has passed." Arthur looked from Julian to the governor, then back to Sloane. His confidence was still there, but it was beginning to fray at the edges, a thread pulling loose on a perfect suit. He forced a laugh, but it sounded thin and hollow against the high ceilings of the ballroom. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Arthur said, his voice rising in pitch as he looked at the witnesses surrounding them. "But I'm the president of this committee. This is my house. These are my people." "Are they?" Sloane asked. She set her glass down on a nearby table. The sound of the glass meeting the marble was the only noise in the room. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 8 o'clock. "The floor is yours, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "Go on. Tell them all about the future of the Beaumont legacy." Arthur sneered, though his hand was trembling as he reached for a silver spoon to tap against his glass. He stepped toward the small dais at the front of the room, the spotlight swinging to follow him. He cleared his throat, looking out at the faces of the city's elite, his ego finally overriding the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice booming once more, "tonight we celebrate more than just a building. We celebrate the power of the Beaumont name." Sloane stood in the shadows, her eyes locked on his. She didn't look at the governor or the board. She only looked at Arthur, waiting for the moment the floor dropped out from beneath him. "Wait for it," she whispered to herself. Arthur adjusted the microphone, the high-pitched screech of feedback echoing through the ballroom like a dying animal. He stood on the dais, his chest puffed out, looking every bit the king of a kingdom he hadn't actually earned. He looked down at the guests, the city's power brokers and social elite, with the casual disdain of a man who believed his blood was made of liquid gold. "The Beaumont legacy is built on excellence," he boomed, his voice amplified to an authoritative roar. "It's about knowing who has the vision to lead, and who is merely background noise." He paused, his gaze landing on Sloane where she stood in the dim light near the velvet curtains. He smirked, gesturing toward her with a dismissive wave of his champagne flute. "Some people spend their lives trying to claw their way into rooms like this, not realizing that pedigree isn't something you can buy at a department store. Security, please see that our uninvited guest is escorted out after I finish. We have standards to maintain." The room rippled with a few uncomfortable titters, but mostly a heavy, expectant silence took hold. Sloane didn't flinch. She felt the cold weight of her phone in her evening bag, a secret power that Arthur couldn't even fathom. She caught the eye of Julian Vane, who was positioned near the technician's booth. The lawyer looked as sharp as a razor in his midnight blue suit, his thumb hovering over a tablet. He gave a single, slow nod. "Wait for it," Sloane breathed, the words barely a ghost of a sound against the smell of expensive lilies and the faint, metallic scent of the AV equipment. Arthur turned back to the crowd, his arms spread wide. "And now I'd like to show you the blueprints for our future. The new Beaumont Plaza, a monument to..." The giant projector screen behind him flickered. The architectural rendering of a glass skyscraper vanished, replaced instantly by a high-resolution scan of a private ledger. Then came the bank transfers. Row after row of red ink appeared, detailing millions of dollars moved from the Beaumont Charitable Trust into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Arthur's signature, bold and unmistakable, was looped at the bottom of every digital authorization. The color didn't just leave Arthur's face. It seemed to be sucked out by an invisible vacuum. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the broken capillaries on his cheeks stand out like jagged lightning against a stormy sky. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that made his expensive dental veneers look like a row of mismatched tombstones. His eyes, once bulging with arrogance, shrank into pinpricks of frantic terror as they darted toward the screen, his pupils dilating until the blue of his irises was swallowed by a void of panic. A single, heavy bead of sweat broke from his receding hairline, carving a glistening path through his thick foundation and dripping onto his silk tie, which now seemed to be tightening around his throat like a noose as his chest heaved in shallow, jagged gasps. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the projector. Governor Harrison stood up slowly, his face hardening into a mask of pure political ice. He looked at the screen, then at the man on the stage, and stepped back as if Arthur were suddenly contagious. Lydia Vance, who had been standing at the foot of the stage ready to lead the applause, let out a sharp, audible gasp. She didn't move toward him to help. Instead, she physically recoiled, her silk gown rustling as she stepped behind a group of board members, her eyes already scanning the room for an exit strategy. Near the kitchen doors, Marcus Thorne stood with his arms folded, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips as he watched the man who had once called him invisible crumble into dust. Sloane stepped out of the shadows, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the steady, rhythmic beat of a funeral march. She walked toward the stage, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped at the edge of the dais, looking up at the shaking man who had tried to humiliate her only moments ago. "You were right about one thing, Arthur Beaumont III," she said, her voice a calm, lethal blade that carried to the very back of the hall. "Pedigree can't be bought, but neither can a conscience. You spent so much time worrying about who belonged in this room that you forgot I'm the one who paid for the floor you're standing on. Aegis Capital has officially foreclosed on every Beaumont asset, including this building." She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his shattered gaze. "You have 10 minutes to leave before the police arrive to discuss those wire transfers. I suggest you start walking." Without waiting for a response, Sloane turned her back on him. She didn't look back to see him collapse against the podium or to hear the sudden, deafening roar of the crowd as they turned on their former idol. She simply walked toward the grand mahogany doors, her silhouette tall and unshakable against the glow of the evidence still burning on the screen. The heavy mahogany doors muffled the chaos behind her, but the vibration of the crowd's roar still pulsed through the soles of her shoes. Sloane Sterling didn't stop to savor the sound. She walked with the rhythmic, predatory grace of someone who had spent years calculating the exact weight of this moment. The air in the corridor was cooler, smelling of floor wax and old money, a stark contrast to the heated, suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom she had just dismantled. Waiting by the marble elevator bank was Julian Vane. He looked up from his watch, his expression as unreadable as a ledger, though a sharp glint of satisfaction danced in his eyes. He held out a slim, black leather folder. "The injunctions are being served as we speak," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the silence. "The Beaumont accounts are frozen. By morning, he won't be able to buy a cup of coffee with a Beaumont name tag." Sloane took the folder, the cool texture of the leather grounding her. "And the board?" "Scrambling," Julian replied. "They're already drafting a statement to distance themselves from him. It's a bloodbath in there." Before she could respond, the doors to the hall burst open. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing off the high ceilings. Arthur Beaumont III stumbled out, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his silk tie askew. The composure he had worn like armor for decades had finally shattered. His skin, usually a pampered, healthy bronze, had turned a sickly, translucent gray, like wet parchment. The veins in his temples throbbed with a frantic, uneven rhythm, and his lower lip trembled, a tiny, rhythmic twitch he couldn't suppress no matter how hard he clamped his jaw. "You think you can do this?" he hissed, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, but Julian stepped subtly into his path, a silent, immovable wall. Arthur stopped, his chest heaving. "You're a ghost, Sloane, a nobody I pulled out of the gutter. You have nothing without the prestige I allowed you to touch." Sloane turned slowly to face him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I didn't touch your prestige, Arthur. I bought it. Then I looked at the receipts and realized it was counterfeit." He stared at her, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for a weakness he could no longer find. Behind him, the doors opened again, and a small group of the elite inner circle emerged. Among them was Lydia Vance, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She didn't go to Arthur's side. Instead, she stopped 5 feet away, her eyes raking over him with a cold, clinical detachment. "Lydia," Arthur gasped, reaching out a hand. Tell this woman she's delusional. Call the security team." Lydia didn't move. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, her expression one of mild boredom. The security team is currently busy assisting the federal agents in the back office, Arthur, and I've just finished speaking with the committee. We've decided that your presence is no longer required at this event or on the board. The betrayal hit him harder than the financial ruin. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. Lydia, we've been partners for 10 years. We were associates, she corrected, her voice as sharp as a razor. And I don't associate with liabilities. She turned her back on him, walking toward Sloane with a practiced, sycophantic smile. Sloane, dear, we really should have that lunch we discussed. There's so much Aegis and the committee could do together. Sloane watched the exchange with a hollow sense of justice. She had known Lydia would flip. People like her were loyal only to the winning side. My assistant will check my calendar, Lydia, if there's space between the depositions. The elevator chimed, the golden doors sliding open to reveal Governor Harrison. He stepped out, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. The governor's face was set in a grim mask of authority. He didn't even glance at Arthur, who was now leaning against the wall for support. Sloane, the governor said, nodding curtly. I've seen the wire transfers Marcus Thorne provided. It's a disgrace. I've already spoken to the Attorney General. We'll be moving forward with a full investigation into the Beaumont Estate's municipal contracts. Arthur made a sound, a choked, desperate sob that he tried to turn into a cough. Governor, please, there's been a misunderstanding. The girl is lying, she's... Girl, Sloane interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, is the one holding the keys to your cell, Arthur. She stepped closer to him, close enough to smell the expensive scotch he'd been hiding behind his arrogance. You spent 20 years stepping on people because you thought they were too small to trip you. You forgot that enough small people can move a mountain. She turned to Julian. Is the car ready? Waiting at the curb, he confirmed. Sloane began to walk away, her heels echoing a steady, final beat. Behind her, she heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of the police officers as they rounded the corner from the service entrance. She didn't need to see the handcuffs to know the weight of them. She didn't need to hear Arthur's final, pathetic pleas for a lawyer or a moment of privacy. As she reached the grand entrance of the building, the cool night air hit her face, crisp and cleansing. The city lights stretched out before her, a sprawling grid of possibilities that no longer belonged to the Beaumont name. She felt the folder in her hand, the physical proof of a life reclaimed. She reached the black sedan, the driver holding the door open. Before stepping inside, she paused, looking back at the monolith of the Beaumont Hall. In the shadows of the stone pillars, she saw Marcus Thorne standing near the staff exit. He stood tall, his waiter's jacket gone, replaced by a simple, dark coat. He offered a single, respectful nod. He was free now, too. Sloane sat back against the leather seat as the car pulled away. The silence of the interior was absolute, a hard-earned peace. She closed her eyes, the image of Arthur's collapsing face etched into her mind, not as a trophy, but as a period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. The reckoning was over, but the world she had just inherited was waiting. "Where to, Miss Sterling?" the driver asked. Sloane looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. "To the office, David. We have a lot of work to do." 6 months later, the glass walls of the Aegis Capital headquarters didn't just offer a view of the city. They offered a perspective on how far the world could tilt in half a year. Sloane Sterling sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, the silence of the executive suite, a stark contrast to the orchestrated chaos of the trading floor below. The air here smelled of rich espresso and the faint, ozone scent of high-end air filtration. It was the smell of absolute control. Julian Vane stepped into the office without knocking, his footsteps silent on the deep pile of the silk rug. He looked the same, sharp, predatory, and entirely at home in the stratosphere of high finance. He dropped a single, slim folder onto her desk. "The final liquidation is complete," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "The last of the Beaumont properties in the Hamptons sold this morning. After the creditors and the legal fees were settled, there was exactly enough left to cover his outstanding bar tab at the club, which, ironically, revoked his membership yesterday." Sloane didn't pick up the folder. She didn't need to. She had tracked every penny of Arthur's descent with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She leaned back, her fingers tracing the cold, heavy weight of a silver fountain pen. And the man himself. He's currently residing in a studio apartment in Queens. It's perched right above a 24-hour laundromat, Julian said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. I believe the vibration of the industrial dryers keeps him up at night. He tried to call the office again this morning. He wanted to discuss a consulting arrangement. He thinks his name still has value. Sloane looked out at the horizon. The sun was dipping low, casting long, jagged shadows across the skyscrapers. He still hasn't realized that names are only worth the integrity behind them. He's persistent, I'll give him that, Julian remarked, moving to the window. He was downstairs an hour ago. Security had to ask him to leave the lobby. He was wearing the same suit he wore to the Beaumont Hall Gala. It's looking a bit tired, frayed cuffs. He's lost weight, but not the healthy kind. He looks like a man who has discovered that champagne doesn't actually provide any nutrients. Sloane felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't pity. It was a cold, hard recognition of the cycle. She remembered the wine stain on her dress, the way he had laughed while the board watched. She remembered the feeling of being invisible. Now she was the sun they all orbited. Lydia Vance called me yesterday, she said, changing the subject. Julian raised an eyebrow. Looking for a job. Looking for a bridge, Sloane corrected. She's trying to distance herself from the scandal. She claimed she was always uncomfortable with Arthur's methods. She offered to host a fundraiser in my honor. I told her I don't require her validation or her guest list. And Marcus Thorne is doing well, Sloane said, and this time a genuine smile touched her face. His new restaurant opened in the West Village last week. It's booked through the end of the year. He sent me a bottle of vintage Bordeaux with a note that just said, "Justice tastes better than wine." She stood up, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood border of the room. She walked to the window and looked down. Far below, the tiny specks of people moved like ants. Somewhere down there, Arthur Beaumont III was walking the pavement, perhaps looking up at this very window, wondering how the girl he had dismissed as a sleeping lion had ended up owning the jungle. The victory was absolute. The Beaumont name was a punchline in the circles where it used to be a prayer. She had her father's legacy back. The company was thriving, and the corruption that had rotted the committee had been carved out. But as she caught her reflection in the glass, Sloane noticed the hardness in her own eyes. The girl who had entered Beaumont Hall 6 months ago with nothing but a secret and a grudge was gone. In her place was someone who knew exactly how to dismantle a human life. She had one, but the cost was a certain kind of peace. She no longer looked for the best in people, she looked for their levers. "Is that all, Sloane?" Julian asked, his hand on the door handle. "For today," she replied. As he left, the office returned to its heavy, expensive silence. Sloane picked up her phone. There was a new notification, a secure message from an anonymous source. It contained a single image, a blurry photo of a meeting between Governor Harrison and a man she didn't recognize, taken in a dark corner of a restaurant she knew wasn't on the governor's official schedule. Sloane felt the familiar hum of adrenaline. The Beaumont chapter was closed, but the book was far from finished. She looked back out at the city, the lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. The view from the top was beautiful, but it was also very, very high. And the higher you climbed, the more you could see the shadows moving in the streets below. She sat back down, the obsidian desk cool beneath her palms. "David," she said into the intercom, her voice steady and cold. "Get Julian back in here. We have a new problem."
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.